us from. My, na- my name is Dr. Dennis Osei, and welcome to today's webinar. This webinar is going to help us present the findings that is coming out from the literature review report from the Youth Project. Obviously, if you've always been joining us, the Youth Project is about examining the contributions of the nonprofit sector to the creation of dignified and fulfilling work. So for today, we are happy to inform you that we will be presenting 3 of our literature review reports that are ready. So we'll be doing that for South Africa, and I will do that for Kenya, and then Côte d'Ivoire. We'll have 3 of our presenters ready to do that. But before we get into that, we'll invite the CAPSI director, Professor Moyo, who Professor Moyo has been able to join, Professor Moyo to give us a brief welcome remarks and overview of this particular series. Over to you, Prof. Moyo.
Thank you so much, Dennis, and welcome everyone to yet another exciting conversation on what's happening in the 3 different countries regarding the non-profit sector and its ability to create dignified and fulfilling jobs for young people. I think we've been doing this for a while now, and I think we're beginning to see the picture that is emerging in all of these countries in different regions. And so I'm excited that we have 3 colleagues that will be presenting on the 3 countries, and then followed by some discussants that will offer different perspectives on how the findings land in their particular sectors. Of course, these presentations are not necessarily validations to strengthen the research, because the research has been published. But some of the conversations that we are having are to help us understand what these findings mean to us in our different settings. So some of us could be coming from the different sectors, such as religion, such as women empowerment, such as youth, and different expressions. When you listen to these findings, what exactly comes to mind, and how, and what implications do they have for policy, for advocacy, et cetera, et cetera? And so we're hoping that with all these webinars, what we're trying to get out there is the message that our young people are the future, and as such, research is beginning to show us how we ought to be budgeting for them, how we ought to be creating not just jobs, but jobs that are fulfilling and dignified. And so I will hand over back to you, Dennis, and I really thank each and every one of you that have joined, and wish that we're going to have a successful conversation. Thank you so much, Dennis. Back to you.
Thank you, Prof, for the overview. We'll move straight into the presentation, but usually the order of the day is that we have our presenters have 20 minutes of presentation. We'll take all the presentations, and then we invite the discussants to share. As Prof. Boy has indicated, you share this, you discuss based on your current experience and whatever that you are doing as part of the process of sharing some insights on the report. So without wasting much time, I will start I will invite Prof. Klingwe to do the presentation on South Africa. Over to you, Prof.
Good afternoon, colleagues, and thank you so much, Chairperson. As I did say that from where I am, I'm unable to share my screen, so I'll be also requesting to close my video for presentation. And I'll be requesting someone to move slides from the other side. Not sure if they'll be in sync. Okay.
Jacqueline, will you please confirm that you can see the screen now?
Yes, I can see the screen. So you can move to the first slide. So I did say because of the change of the dates, I'm unable to use my laptop where I'm at because I'm traveling home. So I won't be able to see the screen as you are scrolling, but I'll try to give you a signal of we are moving to the next slide. All right. So I think the background has already been provided in terms of the work, the ongoing work, but also since other case studies, country case studies have been presented, there is now, for those who have been around the space, there is kind of an understanding of what this work seeks to do. From the South African perspective, this study also emerged as part of the broader continental inquiry into whether the nonprofit sector in Africa is merely compensatory, filling gaps left by the state and market, or whether it constitutes a structurally significant economic actor in its own right. In South Africa, in particular, this question is particularly urgent given the scale of youth unemployment and the country's deep structural inequality. Our view then does not treat a non-profit sector as a moral category, but we treat it as an economic institution that is embedded in labor market dynamics. So the central analytical move for this particular literature review study is to shift from asking, does the sector create jobs, to asking what kinds of economic participation does it enable, or under what structural constraints. So as you see the statistics, youth unemployment in South Africa is not cyclical, but it is structural in a sense. The 62% of unemployment rate among the 15 to 20-year-old reflects partly historical educational inequality, among other issues, spatial apartheid demographies, persistent skills mismatch, and capital-intensive economic growth, as well as limited labor absorption. For the not in employment, education, or training, the NEET category, this one is particularly important because it captures youth who are structurally excluded from both the labor market as well as the skills pipeline. So in the policy discourse, the NEET, youth are often treated as a homogeneous problem category. That's what the literature suggests. However, the literature also shows a significant internal differentiation by race, gender, disability, as well as geography in terms of where these young people are located, whether in the urban centers or within the rural areas. So that's any evaluation of nonprofit sector then must be situated within these layered exclusions. So, Joseph, I've moved to the research architecture slides. I'm sorry, I can't see your slides there, but just to give you a clue, I'm on the research architecture slide. So the 5 research questions that informed this literature review, they move deliberately from the question of scale to quality as well as to structure. And this sequences matters, as we were reviewing this literature. Because much of the literature stops at scale in terms of number of beneficiaries, the number of placements, and number of internship. But scale without quality analysis risks reproducing a minimalist definition of economic participation. So by structuring the review around questions of economic distribution, dignified work, subsector segmentation, knowledge gaps, and future potential, here we interrogate not only outputs, but institutional capacity and structural tensions that emerge within the sector. I've moved, Joseph, to the economic contribution of the nonprofit sector. So the figure here of approximately 50 billion contribution of the GDP and 2% of unemployment, this was during the time of the research as per the published report. This figure then positions the nonprofit sector as economically visible, but also not dominant. However, we must also interpret these numbers cautiously, not just to read them or absorb them as they come. So in reading these numbers or figures, three structural measurement issues emerge. The first is the fact that registration is voluntary, leading to undercounting. Employment data is fragmented and inconsistent. And the third issue is that youth-specific disaggregation remains weak across the recording. So that's the sector scale may be underestimated, but its composition remains analytically opaque. So the lack of disaggregated data then complicates claims about economic transformation within the South African landscape and the role of the nonprofit sector in creating dignified work. Joseph, I've moved to slide number 5 on the nature and forms of employment contribution. So the sector operates across multiple labor market functions. These include direct employment, skills intermediation, entrepreneurship incubation, as well as policy advocacy. And if you go into the report itself, you'll see details on some of the participating organizations who have been doing very important work within the space. So for us, really reading this multifunctionality is very important because the sector is not simply an employer, but it is also a labor market intermediary. However, what we found in literature is that the literature privileges program outputs in terms of the numbers of the youth trained, the numbers of the youth placed, and the number of the youth funded. There is far less evidence on the duration of employment, the wage levels, career mobility, as well as long-term income stability. So for us, then this asymmetry between output reporting and impact evaluation is a recurring theme that is important as we were mapping the literature moving forward. I've moved it to the slide on reaching youth at the margins. So here we deploy the concept of intersectionality, of which most of you might be familiar with. And for those who are not, intersectionality here refers to the overlapping and compounding effects of race, gender, class, disability, citizenship, status on labor market exclusion. And this is particularly applied within the context of this particular study, but intersectionality can be broader than that depending on what you are researching. But while the sector works in marginalized communities, systemic evidence on how youth-shaped program designs also remains limited. So there are two conceptual tensions that emerge here. The first tension is that marginality is often treated descriptively rather than analytically. So there is limited intersectional analysis of how race, gender, disability, and geography interact. And then the second tension is youth are often positioned as beneficiaries rather than co-architects of institutional design. The question therefore becomes, does the sector empower youth structurally or they incorporate them programmatically? And this distinction is critical then when we are assessing transformative capacity, because this is what is missing in the literature that we're reviewing. So from employment to dignified and fulfilling work, the International Labour Organization defines decent work, among other definitions, as employment that ensures rights, security, and dignity. And I want to center these three out of the definitions that exist there because they are analytically important here. But dignity, what is important is that dignity is not merely regulatory compliance, but it includes questions of agency, stability, progression, psychological safety, as well as recognition. But within South African employment literature, this literature remains heavily quantitative in nature. In our review, then, we find that qualitative dimensions of work, especially dignity and fulfillment, are under-theorized. So this creates a conceptual blind spot where we measure jobs but not lived experience. And I think further work around further research around this work then has to move beyond these quantitative dimensions to qualitative dimensions, where we then focus on lived experiences of these youth that we only understand in terms of figures now. And then I move to the precarity paradox. So here lies one of the most important analytical findings from the literature. The nonprofit sector is structurally dependent on donor funding and short-term grants, and I think this emerges even from other country case studies. So the problem here is that this donor dependency produces contractual instability, volunteer-heavy employment, as well as wage compression within some subsectors. Yet the same sector is also expected to generate stability for marginalized youth. So this paradox does not invalidate the sector's contribution per se, but it introduces a structural ceiling on the kind of stability it can produce without funding reform. So if we were to measure the impact of the non-profit sector, these are some of the issues that we need to take into consideration in terms of what are we expecting of them, and if whatever that we are expecting is possible given these limitations. So now I move to informal, I move to the move from informal to formal employment transitions. The informal sector in South Africa remains very important because it employs, during the time of the research, roughly, and this was according to the available statistics. So it employs roughly 20% of the workforce. So it functions simultaneously as a survival mechanism on one hand, and on the other hand, as a site of vulnerability. So nonprofit interventions attempt to formalize youth participation through recognition of prior learning certification, apprenticeship, partnership, business formalization support. However, the literature itself does not robustly evaluate the retention in formal employment, the wage mobility, as well as questions around transition to durability. So we can see that these are happening. There are mechanisms in place that are a form of intervention, but it's not clear in the literature whether these they might translate to formal employment, and if they do, what is the durability of that transition. So thus, within this space, we see a promise, but also limited longitudinal evidence, and perhaps this is another area for further research to explore the relationship between the formal and the informal and the formal sector, and the role of NPOs in terms of facilitating that transition. So I move to the subsectoral contributions. So the subsector segment matters because it shapes labor outcomes. For example, care and community services are often feminized, and they are lower paid. Information and communication technology also offers higher wages potential, but also requires digital access and prior skills. Entrepreneurship pathways carry high volatility as well as failure rates. So the literature review then finds no systemic mapping of which subsector is the largest youth employer. So without this mapping, really, labor market influence remains unevenly understood. So for us to really understand the influence of the non-profit sector or the subsectors, within the space, we need to have this kind of systemic mapping of these subsectors and see their contribution in real time. So in terms, as I move towards closing, I now look at the emerging knowledge gaps. So the most significant finding here leans towards it may be epistemic in nature. We lack consolidated national employment tracking for the sector. Standardized, we also lack standardized metrics for job quality. We lack youth perception data. We also lack intersectional employment analysis, as well as clear differentiation between formal and informal placements. So this fragmentation therefore limits policy alignment, funding targeting, impact evaluation, as well as institutional learning. The sector's transformative potential on its own is partially constrained by its own data architecture, because we found that there are a lot of gaps in terms of data. So in terms of possibilities and opportunities, at this point, it might be tempting really, to conclude with a list of scalable solutions, such as technology platforms, apprenticeship models, public-private partnerships, as we have seen being implemented by different organizations. As I said, if you go into the report in detail, you will see how these become play an intervention role. However, then the literature compels a more cautious position. The question is not simple, what could the sector do? But perhaps the important question here is, under what structural conditions can the sector sustainably expand dignified youth employment? So we've already noted, or we note in the literature, a few structural constraints that shape possibility. Technology-enabled platforms, for example, they offer powerful mechanisms for reducing spatial exclusions and improving job matching. However, without addressing digital inequalities such as platforms, such platforms may privilege youth who are already semi-connected. And this is important, especially when I go back to the beginning of my presentation, where I spoke about the apartheid geographical spatial divisions in terms of those places that are still they remain marginalized, and therefore it means connection to technology also in those areas is still a challenge. So the other intervention is recognition of prior learning systems that can formalize informal skills, particularly for youth in precarious work. Yet the certification process only translates into dignity where labor demand and employer recognition exists. Because sometimes, as we've already noted, there is a mismatch between the skills that are required, that are on demand, and the ones that exist. But also there is a question of employer recognitions of that prior learning. The other issues on apprenticeship pathways and public-private partnerships that appear promising, especially in bridging entry into formal employment. But then their durability really depends on sustained private sector absorption beyond subsidized placements. Similarly, as well, youth-led governance and funding reform are not cosmetic adjustment. They are structural preconditions. Without stable funding cycles and integrated employment data systems, scaling risk, increasing programs reach without strengthening the job quality. So the opportunity horizon is real, but it is institutionally mediated. Expansion of dignified and fulfilling youth employment, therefore, depends not only on innovation, but on structural alignment between funding, data, labor demand, and governance reform. So in conclusion, the non-profit sector in South Africa is economically significant. That has emerged very strongly in the literature. It is also deeply embedded in marginalized communities, and it is also a critical labor market intermediary. However, its contribution to dignified and fulfilling work remains partially under-evaluated. If the sector is to realize transformative potential, there are three main shifts that are necessary here. The first shift is from output counting to quality evaluation. The second one is from fragmented data to consolidated labor tracking. The third one is from short-term funding cycles to structural sustainability. So the central argument really pursued in this review is therefore not the one that celebrates or that is celebratory in nature, but also it is not dismissive at all, but it is conditional. The sector's ability to create dignified work depends not only on program design, but on institutional architecture and funding ecology. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you so much, Professor Klingaway, for such a brilliant presentation. So, colleagues, I will urge you to use the comment section to provide some comments and feedback on this report. But we will have a time to read out these comments and also the opportunity to also share some thoughts on these findings as well. So I'll thank you so much, Professor Klingaway. I'll move on to the next presenter, which is Dr. Roslyn. Please, the floor is yours. Dr. Roslyn will be presenting on the report on Kenya.
Okay, thank you, Chair, and thank you to everyone who was able to attend this session. So by name, as you've heard, I'm Roslyn, and I'm going to present to you the literature review analysis for Kenya on how the contribution of the non-profit sector to dignified and fulfilling work for the Kenyan youth. So first, I'm going to start with the context of the Kenya youth so we understand why do we really concentrate on the youth. So if you look at Kenya as a country, we can say Kenya is among the youngest countries in the world. And the reason for that is because nearly 75% of the population is under the age of 35. So what this means is that if you look at the demographic, we can say that there's a dividend, or it's always described as demographic dividend. And the reason is because it offers an opportunity, especially if they are contributing economically to the country. However, if you look at it, 20 to 35% of the youth are unemployed. And then 77% of those who are employed are in vulnerable employment. If you go deeper, you realize that in Kenya, there is low formal absorption from the formal sector. So mostly youths, about 83% or even more, are transitioning to informal sector. 1 in 3 cannot find work despite actively seeking. And even when you want to talk about underemployment, those who have employment, but maybe not in the sectors that they are or doing what they are supposed to be doing, it accounts for 16%. So now when you look at all these figures, you realize even there's a gender issue here, disparity. So when you look at the women who are not in any employment or education, their rate is higher than or even double than the men at 26%, while men stand at 14.9%. When you look at all these statistics, you realize that this is either an opportunity for Kenya or a setting time bomb. And the reason why I'm saying this is because if you look at the trends that are going on in terms of the rising unemployment and the low absorption from the formal sector, you realize that if they cannot be able to come up with a solution for this, then it's going to be a crisis. So we are going to say that the crisis is not just simply about the joblessness, we want to look at the job quality if we really want to offer dignified and fulfilling work for the youth. So most of the young people that we see now in Kenya, they are working in unstable, low-paying, and unprotected conditions. And this is the reason why this study becomes relevant, where we ask ourselves, are nonprofits really creating dignified and fulfilling work for the Kenyan youth? So as I go along, I'm going to still be in the context because we want to understand who are these nonprofits and what are they doing. So when you look at the nonprofit sector in Kenya, I tried to look at the definitions and things like that, what it encompasses. So mostly definition, they define it in what encompass the nonprofit sector. So we have the formal entities, and those are the NGOs, the CLGs, the societies, trust, cooperatives, and trade unions. There are also the grassroots entities. Those are the community-based organizations, self-help groups, whether they are youth or women groups. And then there is another aspect of it which is becoming popular, which is the social enterprises. And those ones are regarded as hybrid entities because of the balance between the economic and the social side of it. And normally those ones in Kenya are registered under the company limited by guarantee. So when you look at all these, yes, you can acknowledge them, but especially if you look at the grassroots entities, the CBOs, most of them are not registered. So in that case, when we'll be looking at the numbers of the NPOs, they might not actually be accounted. So the challenge that we have when we look at all this is that you cannot estimate their numbers because of the inconsistent definition and officially recorded data. Another thing is that the NPO sector actually do not have a national typology, which actually defined who is who should be included, especially when you start including the social enterprise in that category. So moving on from that conceptualization, I wanted to clarify what do we really mean by dignified and fulfilling work, especially in the African context. Because the first thing when I was given the project to do, I was just thinking to myself, what does it mean to have dignified work or a fulfilling job? Is it the same in the Western countries, like in the African context? And when you look at the literature, mostly when we want to reference dignity or fulfilling work, we use the Western theories. And even in this literature review, because there is no African theory that can explain this, we were able to rely on the ILO concept, which is, they call it decent work, which was more close to what we were looking at. So for them, they define decent work as productive in terms of fair income, workplace security, social protection for the family, personal development opportunities, social integration, whether it's freedom to express concerns or organize, or even equality of opportunity and treatment. Another reference that we used is the Mastercard Foundation, the 4 markers, whether it's reliable income, reputable work, respectful in workplace, and sense of purpose, which I thought was more practical than actually the ILO, which seems to be all-encompassing. On the other hand, when you talk about fulfilling work, we have to look at the literature and some of the things. When you talk about fulfilling, you are talking about job satisfaction, meaningful work, work engagement, positive workplace, and things like that, flexibility depending on that. So what you realize, especially when you are defining dignified or fulfilling work, there is no consensus on categorization. And that's why it was so hard to actually pin it out and say, do these NPOs actually provide dignified? What am I looking for here? So I think also another loophole that we are having in these frameworks is that when you apply the Western theories in the African context, there's an oversight which is very important, which is the social and cultural differences. When you talk about even the standards of employment contracts, when you talk about intersectionality, for somebody who is a woman who is already marginalized and then maybe disabled. So how are you going to define dignified and fulfilling work for such an individual? So, but for the reference of this study, we were able to maybe reference some of these issues. So when we were looking at the demographics in Kenya, I thought it's not fair for us to talk about dignified and fulfilling work if we are not going to talk about informality, because that's where most of the youth are finding jobs currently. So let's look at some of the structural barriers to dignity, especially when we talk about the informality. So when you're talking about the Kenyan context, 83% of the workforce is informal, okay? That means the jobs lack contracts, benefit, or protection. Even when you look at the GDP of the country, as much as it's expanding or increasing, when you compare with the informality is not shrinking. So that means the low absorption of employment from the formal sector. So most of the jobs that are created, whether they are new or majority, they come from the informal sector. So when we are looking at the policy, okay, and even the frameworks that you are using to define, most of them assume that informality is transitional because we are based on the Western kind of context where it is a stage that you can pass and surpass through formalization. But if you look at the Kenyan context, data suggests that informality is a structural feature. It's the same thing, for example, if we start saying, let's eradicate poverty. I feel like informality is in the same space where we are trying to say, let's eradicate informality, yet we are not coming up with any other solution on how we are going to observe all these youth to the formal sector. So if that is the case, then we need strategies oriented exclusively towards the formal sector transition. Or we can say they are misaligned with the labor market realities if we are going to talk about transition, especially in the Kenyan context. Because when you look at this and you ask yourself, is dignity tied to formalization? Maybe the question that we need to maybe ask ourselves is, can dignity exist within informal systems? Or maybe more critically, who defines dignity? Is it the policymakers? Is it the donors? Or is it the youth themselves, especially coming from the African context? For example, for the Kenyan youth, dignity may not mean formal employment. It may mean formalizing the dignity within the informal work. And I think this is one of the areas that we really need to confront. Instead of pushing for formalization as a destination, where maybe we are going to reach in another decade, it may be more strategic to upgrade dignified conditions inside informality, because that is where the youth actually work. And that was one of the major gaps that we identified when we were talking about the Kenyan youth and dignified work in the Kenyan system. So the question that I'm going to pose today for terms of policy is, maybe we need to shift from the transition. Yes, that's one of the brackets, but also maybe confront the giant in the room and think of how can youth move out of informality. We may ask how dignity can be embedded within the ecosystem, informal ecosystem. So when we look at all those, then we can shift to now looking at how does the NPO sector create jobs for youth in Kenya. And the reason why I didn't put dignified and fulfilling is because I thought, as much as maybe they are providing dignified and fulfilling work in Kenya, the data that we had didn't suggest that they are doing so. And some of the reason is because of lack of data, working in silos and things like that. So in this study, we identified ways that they contribute for both as facilitators or enablers, and also there can be barriers to job creation for youth in Kenya. So let's look at the contributions as facilitators and enablers, what really work. So we cannot deny the fact that NPOs in Kenya play a significant role in the labor market in terms of providing direct employment, whether it's volunteerism, also skills development, education and training, entrepreneurship support, technology, digital inclusion, market linkages, advocacy, and policy influence. And I can say there are so many people, whether they are youth or even organizations, that have been supported by the NPO sector, and they've succeeded to where they are. So if you look at the outputs, what we are talking about, currently in 2023, when this study was conducted, there are about 12,000 plus registered NGOs in Kenya. And they were providing 71,000 plus direct employees. And what I think about this is because of lack of data, I think what they mean by direct employees are those who are maybe employed full-time. And because they don't track this, I feel like the number should even be higher than that. In terms of economic contributions for the year, financial year 2021 to 2022, they actually contributed 175.9 billion Kenya shillings. So that's a huge contribution in terms of the economic growth for the Kenyan government in general. What this doesn't say is how much actually went to the youth. Thousands more in the community-based organizations and social enterprises, which have not been accounted for. So in overall, what we can say is that the sector is not small. So looking at these outputs, I think we can pinpoint that NPOs are contributing when it comes to the number of jobs. What we don't know is that job stability over time. What is the quality of the jobs that they are providing? Because that's not accounted for. Of course, we cannot deny the fact that they are contributing economically. What we don't know is that what is the progression pathways for the youths in all these economic contributions. The number of organizations that we can find. When you go deeper into the sector, you don't have the data that actually show the distribution of this youth employment in terms of the types of sectors. Even the program reach. Are they going deep into the rural, or they are just working within where they are convenient? And what is the voice of the youth in all this? So we look at all this, we can say that the NPOs are facilitators. On the other hand, we look at NPOs as barriers to job creation for Kenyan youth. And the reason why we look at this is because it might not be intended for them to be doing that. But because of the structural issues that are going on and also the nature of their work, where they also depend on the funding, some of these things happen, collaterally. For example, if you look at volunteerism, can we actually say volunteerism is a kind of a dignified employment? Or is it a form of exploitation in quotes? Because as much as you want to expose the youths, at the same time, the organizations are looking at how they can subsidize their own organizational labor cost. So do you define that as dignified? Another thing is skill mismatch. So normally, NPOs work under the donor priorities. And when you look at the curricula, they are donor-driven curricula, where they prioritize funding trends over the real market demand. So in that case, if you really want to address the unemployment in Kenya, then you need to be realistic and maybe look at the skills that are there. And another thing that's maybe emerging from the skills mismatch is where we ask ourselves, is it really skills mismatch, or is it that we don't offer the skills that are required, especially with the changing technological advancements that are going on? Look at the AI. If you hire somebody who don't have that qualification, can you say skills mismatch? Or is it a gap that we have that we are not actually filling in terms of these skills that are coming up, the new skills? Another thing is project dependency by the communities. So what the NPOs sometimes do is where the communities depend on them to provide things for them. And they do it when the project ends, that's the end of it. So I think they need to move from that and transition to where they actually make these communities or the people they support in those communities sustainable. That way they are able to facilitate the job creation. Another issue is the parallel systems that collapse. Normally, initiatives, they end abruptly when funding cycles may be closed. So there is no institutional embedding in all this. They don't prepare. So when it ends, it ends. So that's another barrier, especially for those maybe the youth who are depending on to facilitate them or to provide for them the job creation. There's also the issue of the funding trap that's behind these patterns. So if you look at the sources of NGO funding in Kenya, most of them come from the Western countries, and only a small portion of it from maybe within the African context. So what are some of the systemic implications for this? It means that external priorities shape our local programs. And if that's the case, then we have a long way to go in terms of trying to actually provide this dignified and fulfilling work. Short-term projects override the long-term labor market transformations. It's about the quick money, or we do this, and that's it. Sustainability becomes fragile when the donors shift the agendas or stop the funding and things like that, as well as accountability flows where we are more accountable to our donors and not actually to the youths. What do they really want? And this is where the youth agency comes in. So looking at that, as I said earlier, when you want to look at, there is no data about the sectors themselves within the NPO sector. But we tried to look at some of the platforms where these NPOs operate and some of the literature. And we found out that in the analysis, I wanted to look at where are the jobs really for the youth. And then I look at where are the NPOs focused and see whether there is an alignment between the two. So when you look at where the jobs really or opportunities are, the agriculture is the first maybe sector where there are a lot of opportunities or potential. Trade and repairs is another one, ICT and digital services, and also the informal sector and the service sector. So when you look at all this and then you compare with where are the NPOs focused, and from the data that was found, most of the NPOs in Kenya focus on health, that 1% of their expenditure goes to health. And when you look at where jobs are, health maybe doesn't appear among the top 5. Another thing is education, which I think cuts across whether you want to talk about agriculture, so that one is important. But when you talk about education, where exactly in education are you focusing on? And then the third one was the children's program. So you see there is a misalignment or a disconnect between where funding goes and where the youth employment opportunities are. And maybe that's something, a red flag for the NPOs. And this comes about because they actually do not do research, or there is no database where they can refer and say where are the opportunities. So if we want to talk about, for example, something like the agriculture, if they want to promote that, because that was one of the areas where most of the youth, they have a negative perception towards agriculture. And the reason for that is because agriculture has been regarded as labor intensive and maybe not satisfying in a way. Another structural issue is when you are talking about the agriculture, we don't see issues about the gender coming in. Because when you are talking about the African context, especially the African, especially in Kenya, we ask ourselves, do women have land titles, which maybe about 80–90% do not have? Do they actually control the income? So those are some of the variables that are actually we need to confront if we actually want to do this. It's the same thing with technology. If you look at women, they are less likely to own smartphones or afford the data cost and things like that. So those are some of the intersectionalities that maybe when we are talking about the sector or how to offer jobs, we need to consider. So moving from the sector, I wanted to acknowledge some of the knowledge gaps and data deficits that was found from the literature. So the first one was the lack of impact assessment and youth-centered employment tracking. So when you look at the data that's available, the youth is silent, even though it's included sometimes maybe unintentionally because they were part of the project. But to say that there is data exclusively for the youth tracking the employment, you don't find it. So I think what we advocate for here is maybe an aggregated and maybe longitudinal youth employment data for people to be able to track some of these things. Another thing, the NPO sector, they do not have an employment database. Each one of them work in silos and they are donor dependents, especially in their research. So when you are depending on a donor, sometimes you only report the positive side of things and they don't actually confront some of these structural issues that are affecting themselves and also the people that they are actually working for. Working in silos is another gap. And I think that's where they need to move out from, where they are competing for funds and things like that and come to collaborate. And collaboration can go horizontally and also vertically. Vertically in terms of the government, the private sector, and the academia. And when you go horizontally, you coordinate with other NPOs who are working maybe on similar projects. If you really want to address the dignified and fulfilling jobs for the youths. So what I recommend for this is that I think the NBO needs to measure what matter in terms of the job qualities and not just the job numbers. They need to actually conduct genuine needs assessments and stop importing solutions from maybe the Western countries. They need to diversify funds so that they avoid this trap of being maybe dependent on the donor to provide all the funds. Consider intersectionality also due to overlapping vulnerabilities. So in this case, you need, especially the research that was going on, I hope they are going to give us a sense of, let's say, how a young rural woman with disability or a refugee youth in an informal digital work, whether they look at dignified and fulfilling work the same way as a person who don't have those disabilities. So to wrap up my presentation, I just want to advocate for a transformative NPO model. And the reason why I'm saying is because if NPOs are serious about actually transforming, whether it's the youths or making a difference in a practical way in Kenya, they need to have that vision. So when they're talking about the youths and dignified and fulfilling work, they need to have a vision rooted in the context where you try to understand what youths actually want. Talk about inclusion, because these things, they've been talking decades and decades, coming up with policies, and yet we still have the problem. Also work with other parties, especially the government, and challenge them in terms of economic justice or injustices that are going on in the country. And the last one is to call for data sovereignty, intersectional programming, and sector formalization, so we can track and know exactly how many NPOs are in Kenya. I'm wrapping up, and how are they providing jobs for the youths in Kenya? So I think that comes to the end of my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Roslyn, for the presentation and for the insight. So we'll go to the next presentation, and I see there are questions in the chat. Some are requesting for the slides. I've posted the links to the papers. It's good to read the entire reports. So you can access it on our website, capsi.co.za. So that is that. So we'll move on to Professor Seme. Prof, over to you. Please share your slides and go ahead with the presentation.
Hello, good morning. So today I will share insight from a recent literature review examining how the nonprofit sector contribute to the creation of dignified and fulfilling work opportunities for young people in Côte d'Ivoire. I will up. It's not moving. Okay. Sorry. So I will start by presenting the context. Youth unemployment remains one of the most pressing development challenges in Côte d'Ivoire, with a predominant young population and hundreds of thousands entering the labor market annually. Formal employment systems struggle to absorb this demographic pressure. While government intervention are significant, they are insufficient alone. Structural constraints such as skill mismatch and access to finance continue to limit youth integration into the labor market in Côte d'Ivoire, as you see the numbers. And so the problem here, and why look at the nonprofit sector? The nonprofit sector play a complementary role through vocational training, entrepreneurship support, and income-generating initiatives. Yet, its contribution remain insufficiently documented. There is little systematic understanding of how nonprofit organizations support youth livelihood. Therefore, the key question is, what role does the nonprofit sector play in the creation of dignified and fulfilling work and opportunities for young people in Côte d'Ivoire? And this is what I will try to answer through this literature review. And while there is a considerable knowledge about government intervention for young people, there is limited knowledge about NPOs. This study aims to fill this gap by assessing the contribution of the nonprofit sector to creating dignified and fulfilling jobs and opportunities for young people in Côte d'Ivoire. So I will focus on youth employment, economic inclusion, and dignified and fulfilling work. The methodology used for this literature review, I use three main approaches: academic literature review, government documentation, interviews with some NPOs. This was necessary because there is very limited statistical data on NPO job creation in Côte d'Ivoire. Thus, due to data scarcity, the study relies on qualitative analysis and exploratory interview. Yeah, I don't have much data to share, so it is more a qualitative analysis that I'm presenting. What is NPO in Côte d'Ivoire? How do we define that? In Côte d'Ivoire, the legal definition of non-profit encompasses a wide range of actors working for public interest without distributing profit to members. So the law, there is a new law that was promulgated in 2024 related to civil society organizations. And according to this law, NPOs included association, NGOs, foundation, religious organizations. So what their defining feature is that they reinvest resources into social mission rather than distributing profit. This is the key element that define them according to this law. Now, what is dignified work? Dignified work is not only about employment and income. It is about recognition, security, fairness, and meaningful participation in society. In fact, work becomes fulfilling when it enhances human values. And according to the literature in Côte d'Ivoire, this is what we can see, the aspect through which we define dignified work. Now I'm moving to the key contributions. So the first contribution, the economic contribution of NPOs. Many NPOs act as incubators for employment through training programs aligned with labor market needs. They often fill gaps where state capacity is limited. Usually they are involved in vocational training, income generating activities, entrepreneurship support. What are the NPO employment mechanisms? How do they create a job? We identify three critical mechanisms. This is related to skill development or microfinance or support to self-employment. And we also noted that the literature review also showed that income generating activities enable youth, especially women and rural population to generate income independently. So in the villages, in rural area, income generation activities have been very, very important. So another key contribution is social inclusion. NPO promote community hiring, participation, and empowerment. Indeed, job creation often fosters social purpose and belonging. This is something that happens heavily during the qualitative analysis. So what are the key sectors for NPO activities, their sectoral impact? We have identified 4 main areas. NPO activity is strongest in social cohesion, agriculture, health, and education. These sectors generate both employment and social impact. These sectors also receive the strongest donor support and generate the most youth employment opportunities. Maybe I have to explain a little bit for social cohesion. Côte d'Ivoire is a post-conflict country, and that's why we still have a lot of NGOs that are involved in peace building, in human rights, and several things that are related, several activities that are related to social cohesion. So this may be a distinctive feature of NPOs in Côte d'Ivoire. So the impact of NPOs in job creation. Impact assessment shows strong outcome in employment access and income growth. Beyond income, NPO jobs provide first professional experience, community engagement, and income growth. Many young gain purposeful, socially meaning work. Now, the limitation of NPO contribution to creation of dignified and fulfilling work and opportunities for young people in Côte d'Ivoire. These have already been said by previous presenters. Most NPO rely heavily on external funding. This leads to project-based employment, limited long-term stability. Local organizations often offer short-term contracts. Jobs often end when funding cycles conclude. Local organizations often also provide low wages. They also depend on donor cycles. So many jobs are transitional rather than permanent. Also, employment qualities improve mostly when organizations meet international funding standards. And this is really, this shows the precarity of jobs created by NPOs. What are the major research gaps that we found in the literature review? So we have identified this knowledge gap, no mapping of total NPO employment in Côte d'Ivoire, unknown job quality. We don't know the quality of the job created by the NPOs. We do have a few interviews where we have some ideas, but there is no systematic study about that. There is a lack of youth perception data on the job created by NPOs. Does evidence gap limit policy impact? This highlights the need for future empirical research. And the conclusions. So in conclusion, NPOs play a significant role in youth employment in Côte d'Ivoire. They provide pathway to dignity and empowerment, but sustainability remains fragile. The sector is impactful. It's played a meaningful yet structurally constrained role in youth employment. To fully leverage the sector, I suggest this recommendation. First, to improve data system and strengthen local fundings. The future of dignified youth employment in Côte d'Ivoire depends not only on market or state, but also on strengthening the institutional ecosystem and non-profit organizations. So this is what I want to share with you. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor Sene, for the great presentation. So we'll move on to our discussants before we come to you, the audience, if there's any questions that you want to pose. But let me start with you, Dr. Flata Moyo. You know, I know you as an advocate for gender justice and a feminist scholar. So maybe you share some reflections. What do you make out of these findings that is coming out from the literature from your perspectives before you get into, discussing the issues around policy implications and then areas that we need to tighten as we move on to the qualitative study of the project, and so forth. And so and also reflecting on these issues based on the current happening on the ground regards to youth employment in South Africa. So over to you, Dr. Moyo.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Greetings from Sunny Neo. in Canton Vaud here in Switzerland. Let me thank the team, the research team, especially because this is really a deeply necessary project and very important. I want to raise my voice, as you've said, engaging the South African chapter of the study through what I call feminist ethics of Ubuntu, for grounding relational interconnectedness, interdependence, and the role of indigenous spirituality and cultural meaning making in shaping how we understand dignified and fulfilling work. I have 7 quick points and a very short conclusion. The first one, reframing work through a feminist ethics of Ubuntu. We know Ubuntu often rendered as umuntu ngumuntu ngabantu. A person is a person through other persons. This is not merely a communitarian slogan among us Africans. In a feminist ethics reading, Ubuntu is an ethos of relational moral personhood. It insists that dignity is not individually possessed, but relationally constituted. So one's humanity is affirmed through networks of care, reciprocity, and mutual recognition. This research project makes a critical move by foregrounding dignity and fulfillment rather than mere employment statistics. So work is not simply income generation. It is participation in the moral and social fabric of community life. For young people, especially in context marked by colonial dispossession and post-apartheid inequality, dignified work is about being seen, being valued, and being needed. Yet Ubuntu must be read critically. So feminist ethics reminds us that relational systems can both nurture and constrain. Interdependence can become surveillance. Community can become regulation. Thus, the project is inviting us to ask these questions. Do non-profit interventions expand relational dignity? Or do they subtly reproduce what I would call patriarchal hierarchies of age, gender, class, and respectability? The second point, interdependence versus neoliberal individualism. One of the project's strongest contributions is its implicit critique of neoliberal employment paradigms. Across much of Africa, youth employment programming has been shaped by entrepreneurial self-reliance models. Be innovative, create your own job, be resilient. A feminist critic of Ubuntu, I would insist that it resists this responsibilization of the individual. It should assert that economic precarity is not a personal failure, but it is a rupture in relational systems. It is historical, it's political, it's economic. And our presenters have actually captured this very clearly throughout. So colonial land dispossession, racialized labor systems, and global capital flows have fractured interdependence in the Ubuntu ethos. So the non-profit sector, as this study shows, often steps into these fractures. But we must insist and ask, are non-profit restoring relational networks of support? Or are they inadvertently reinforcing neoliberal narratives of self-making? The answer likely varies. Where nonprofits cultivate mentorship, solidarity, cooperative models, and collective enterprise, they seem to embody Ubuntu ethics. But where they prioritize individual market insertion without structural critique, they risk replicating the very logics that marginalize youth. Third point, indigenous spirituality and meaning of work. In Africa, you can't talk about these kind of things without actually looking at the spirituality that is underlining in most of these relationships. So a crucial dimension that deserves deeper exploration and which aligns strongly with a feminist Ubuntu framework is the influence of individual spirituality on the conception of work and dignity. In many African cosmologies, work is not purely economic. It is spiritually embedded. It connects individuals to ancestors, to land, to lineage, to community continuity. Work sustains not only the living, but even the moral order. So this raises critical questions. Three of them I want to raise. How do young people interpret fulfilling work within indigenous spiritual frameworks? Does dignified work mean alignment with ancestral purpose? How do faith-based and culturally grounded nonprofit mediate between the market economies and spiritual worldviews? So a feminist ethics of Ubuntu insists that spirituality cannot be dismissed as peripheral. It shapes aspiration. It shapes the feeling of shame when excluded. It shapes hope and belonging. If young people feel excluded from meaningful work, this exclusion is not merely financial for them. It is ontological. It disrupts their sense of being fully human within relational networks that include both the living and the ancestral. Fourth point, gender dimensions of relational work. Professor Ndlovu actually raised this very critically. From a feminist perspective, we must also interrogate whose labor sustains relational systems. Care work, community mediation, emotional labor, as we heard from the presentation, often performed by young women, remains undervalued economically, but it remains central to Ubuntu ethics. Does the non-profit sector recognize and remunerate relational labor? Or does it merely on gendered expectations? Does it rely on gendered expectations of self-sacrifice and service? If dignified work is to be truly fulfilling, it must challenge this patriarchal distribution of value. A feminist Ubuntu framework insists that interdependence cannot be built upon women's invisible and underpaid labor. Not at all. Number 5, youth as moral agents, not beneficiaries. Another strength of this research is its attention to youth voice. Ubuntu ethics affirms that young people are not incomplete adults waiting to be integrated into society. They are actually already moral agents embedded in relational networks. However, relational justice requires more than just consultation. It requires shared authority. Are young people co-creators of these employment initiatives? Do they shape program designs and governance? Are intergenerational hierarchies being reimagined? In many African contexts, we know gerontocracy limits youth decision-making power. A feminist ethics of Ubuntu would call for rebalancing relational authority so that the interdependence becomes reciprocal and not top-down. 6, the political economy of relationality. We must also consider the global funding architecture, which the presenters actually have dealt with it very powerfully. This funding architecture that sustains the non-profit sector from outside the context of where it operates. Many organizations depend on donor priorities shaped outside African context. If Ubuntu centers relational accountability, then to whom are non-profit accountable? To donor? To communities? To youth participants? A feminist ethics of Ubuntu demands grounding accountability, that is, relationships of trust and reciprocity within communities, not merely being compliant with reporting frameworks. 7, which is the last point, scale and sustainability. A financial tension concerns scale. Ubuntu thrives in relational proximity, face-to-face networks of mutual care. Yet youth unemployment is structural and very massive. How do we scale relational dignity without bureaucratizing it into technocratic programming? Perhaps the answer lies not in scaling organizations, but in strengthening ecosystems, networks of community-based, culturally rooted institutions that embed employment within social solidarity. Conclusion, this research project makes very significant contribution. I think for me, shifting of our lens from job quantity to relational quality. Through a feminist ethics of Ubuntu, what I've been arguing about, we see that dignified and fulfilling work is not made about income, but about recognition, belonging, and participation in a moral community. The non-profit sector, at its best, can restore fractured relational networks, bringing young people to opportunity, mentorship, and spiritual cultural affirmations. But at its weakest, I fear, and it has been actually said over and over again, it can replicate neoliberal and patriarchal hierarchies. The question before us, therefore, is not simply, can the non-profit sector create jobs? No, but rather, can it cultivate relational conditions in which young people experience themselves as fully human, interconnected, interdependent, and spiritually anchored within their community? That, I believe, is the deeper ethical horizon this research invites us to pursue. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Moyo, for this great insight and from that lens that you provide your discussions on the work that we presented here. So I'll invite Dr. Sandra. I know you are also an economist. So from your point of view as an economist, what you also make of the findings that we have here, and particularly you narrow it down to the context that you have been assigned to, which is Kenya. Yeah, over to you.
Thank you, Dennis. I would like to thank the author for a very comprehensive review. I think the Kenyan study results are important, they're timely and very policy relevant. If we look at the paper, what it does very well is mapping the landscape of the nonprofit sector's engagement in youth employment and bringing that together with the fragmented strands of literature into a coherent narrative that forms a story of what's really happening in this case. We see that the core argument of the paper is that the NPO sector plays a significant but undermeasured role. It's significant because it contributes to GDP, addressing youth unemployment, facilitating skills development, supporting entrepreneurship, leveraging digital transformation, and assisting transitions from informal to dignified work. And all of this is put for us in a structural context of high youth unemployment in Kenya of 35%, of 83 to 90% in formal employment, of deep gender disparities and severe data gaps. So in terms of the key contributions that the paper makes, I noted down that it brings together the literature that is often treated separately, and that is youth employment, together with informality, together with entrepreneurship and digital transformation, which is quite key in this generation. And it integrates all of these into one discussion about the role of the nonprofit sector in this context. Second, it doesn't treat this sector as homogeneous. It distinguishes it between the subsectors. It looked at ICT, agriculture, as well as micro to small, medium enterprises, which is quite important because the employment dynamics we see across these, they differ significantly. And then thirdly, the paper goes beyond just looking at the job contribution. It goes into a deep discussion in terms of what is dignified and fulfilling work, which shifts the debate from employment quantity to the quality of the employment that we want for the youth. Fourth, it is quite transparent in terms of listing where the knowledge gaps are. You can see that clearly from the paper and the presentation, particularly knowledge gaps in terms of measurement, in terms of informality, and the lack of reliable data on the sector's true economic contribution. So with this in mind, I will share my reflections based on my work experience as an economist. Also working in the nonprofit sector, I work for a digital policy think tank. And in terms of the policy implications, I think this paper really does well to surface a set of deeply policy relevant issues that are often treated in isolation, but are structurally interconnected. So, for example, it brings together targeting of the sector in terms of informality, skills mismatch, policy implications in terms of digital transformation and employment quality for youth employment in the nonprofit sector. However, in my experience in policy design, when you identify gaps, it's also important to ask who is responsible for closing these gaps and through which institutional mechanisms. So firstly, I'd like to talk about the differentiated youth categories. The paper rightly shows that the youth are not homogeneous. And from a policy perspective, this implies that inclusion must be institutionalized, which means, for example, explicitly stating that the Ministry of Public Service, Youth and Gender, working together with the Kenyan National Bureau of Statistics, should require for disaggregated outcome reporting across all youth employment programs. If we are saying that equity is not embedded in monitoring frameworks and funding conditionality, then the policy implication is just aspirational if it doesn't have a specific role player to say that this specific institution is responsible for actioning this policy implication and how they should action that policy implication. Second, if we look at the paper highlights the need for stronger financial and non-financial support system as a policy implication, which is very good. And if we look at it from a digital economy perspective, this is not only about the funding mechanism when we look at grants and mentorship. It is also about the integration of the digital market infrastructure that the youth work in. So, for example, the youth right now, they work with digital payment system, some on e-commerce platforms, some use digital identity verifications and online procurement portals. So when we're looking for a role player to action some of this financial and non-financial support systems, we could look at ministries like the Ministry of Trade and MSME Development in collaboration with the Ministry of ICT and Digital Economy, development finance institutions, and these nonprofit organizations themselves. These institutions must ensure that the youth enterprises are digitally integrated into formal market systems. This will increase that movement from informalization to some sort of formalization, where the informality becomes more visible to the system. Otherwise, the youth entrepreneurs may receive training and seed capital, but remain excluded from the scalable digital markets, which increasingly determine economic opportunity. And third, if we look at the paper's emphasis on dignified and fulfilling work, I think it raises a very crucial measurement issue. Employment numbers alone are insufficient. So the responsibility, we say, could lie with the Kenyan National Bureau of Statistics in collaboration with academic institutions, research institutions to integrate employment quality indicators in their statistics. We're talking about income stability, social protection, coverage, digital access, and integrate these into the labor force surveys of the Bureau. Without proper measurement, policy will continue to optimize for quantity without accounting for the quality. And then fourth, if we're looking at informality remaining a structural reality, and the results showed that over 80% of employment is informal, then formalization must also involve regulatory innovation. I think the paper correctly identifies informality as this structural reality, but digital transformation is reshaping informality today, like I said previously, because we have informal workers transacting digitally, but remaining outside the social protection system. We have informal workers who sell on platforms without legal recognition, and this implies that the Ministry of Labor, together with the National Treasury and ICT regulators, must really rethink formalization for a platform-mediated economy. So formalization of the economy could mean having digitally administered social protection, having simplified mobile-based tax compliance, having recognition of platform-mediated work in labor law. These are just examples. This makes formalization to be technologically enabled and worker-centered and not just administrative. Fifth, if we look at the skills mismatch, which were identified in the paper, we can look at it as a governance issue. where the responsibility here lies with the Ministry of Education, private sector employers, for example, potentially through sector skills councils that provide real-time labor market intelligence. So here, when the author was speaking about the skills mismatch, and it being that training should be demand driven, not necessarily supply driven, and that funding models should incentivize job placement outcomes. I think it's quite key when you recognize the ministries or the role players that should be involved in actioning these different policy implications and also identifying how they can practically be actioned. And then finally, looking at the sustainability of the nonprofit sector itself. If the nonprofit organizations are structural partners in youth employment, then I think it's also quite important for the National Treasury, for example, to consider domestic financing instruments. And these could include matched funding schemes or social impact bonds to reduce overdependence on foreign donors. I think we saw that across all the three countries. And it would really be useful to find more stable funding mechanisms for NPOs, considering that they are already structural partners in youth employment. I think generally the paper does highlight important policy implications across skills systems, informality, gender inclusion, entrepreneurship, digital transformation, and measurement. But like I said again, these implications should be strengthened to involve moving from where the gap is to specifying specifically through the policy implications which responsible bodies should action these implications, which regulatory reform should change, which fiscal instrument and accountability mechanism would translate into promising NPOs to be scalable, sustainable youth employment policy. Thank you. I think I'll stop there.
All right, thank you so much, Sandra. I'll invite Dr. Belafonde from Côte d'Ivoire. I don't know if he's online. If you are, please come in and share your thoughts on the Côte d'Ivoire paper. Hello. I'm not seeing him there, but if maybe you can, we can invite questions now whilst we wait for Dr. Belafonde to join. If there's any questions that you want to raise, please, you can raise your hand and we'll ask you to share that. Any question from the participants or anybody within the team? You see a comment from John Mensah, and John Mensah says many local NGOs in Africa cannot employ young people, mainly because of limited and unsustainable funding. Most rely on short-term donor grants that prioritize project activities over long-term salaries, making it difficult to create permanent jobs for the youth. I think these are some of the comments that are coming out from the presentation. And maybe to you, what do you call it, Dr. Rosalind, there's a comment here from Caroline that says, how did you arrive at the 175.9 billion amount that you raised in your presentation? Maybe you can speak to that whilst we wait for other discussants.
Okay, thank you, Dennis. So let me check because I can't recall it exactly, and then I can put it in the comment section.
Okay, and there's also another comment from Chipamba that says in South Africa, we have two areas on which the ecosystem serves: the social entrepreneurial sector, where most informality is found, that is the MPO NGOs, and then the SME sector, who serve the entrepreneurial ecosystem. But there are various policies and government structures responsible for all, which contributes to the fragmentation and the bureaucracy. So these are some of the thoughts that are coming in. I don't know if any of the presenters will want to share anything on some of these things that have been raised as comments. If you are, please feel free. Any comments, any questions so far?
Okay, Dennis, I'll just take a bite on the South African case in terms of the differences between the two. So uh, it's 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 quite difficult to cover everything when you're trying to fit a 15 something, 20 something page presentation into a 20 minutes paper into a 20 minutes presentation. So in the paper, we do discuss the two separate ones, and we do highlight um, some of the different structures and challenges, especially faced by whether NPOs or NGOs, in terms of the criteria, what defines them, the registration procedures, and some of the challenges that they meet to even become formalized within the system. So social development does control both or regulate both, but yeah, there are challenges there. So we also do highlight some of the work that is done by, for instance, some of the organizations like NYDA, which is quite prevalent in terms of, which is quite important in terms of working with young people, skills development, entrepreneurship, opportunities, where they even give funding to youth to start their own businesses. But these actually government aligned, they are government funded and all of that. So in the report, we do explore both. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Any other reflections? I don't know if there's any other reflections from anybody here. Any questions from online? I see another question that says social development regulates only NGO and DTIC regulates MPO, and then COGHSTA regulates township business like tax shops. Can you please, okay, this is about sharing the report, but the link of this report has been pasted in the chat. So if you can go to our website, all the reports are there, and then you will be able to access the reports. Is there any other question again? As we Hello, I don't know if Dr. Belafonte is joined the meeting using the attendees. If you are there, please you can mute yourself and speak. Mute yourself.
I had my hand up. I don't know whether you can see it.
Sorry, I didn't see that. Please go ahead.
Yeah, and this is in relation to some of the stats that are reported in the Kenyan report, which I think the author does a good job in terms of problematizing the conceptions of nonprofits, but also the difficulty of a physical count on them. But I think the stats that are now being cited in terms of numbers of registration and contributions to the economy are very skewed to one particular, I think it subsumes NGOs as the only category to use that, which to some extent skews the entire review. Yes, this background noise, which is quite annoying. I don't know exactly where it's coming from. Someone needs to mute themselves, probably. Sorry. So I think even as we acknowledge the difficulties of being days, probably some of the things that we need to do is to say that, for instance, within one of these particular categories of the nonprofits, former NGOs, and they are registered in one particular area. And I'm saying this knowing that in a study that I was involved in Kenya in early 2000s, they reported in a 2005 report, we had about 500,000, 250,000 nonprofits in various categories. So therefore, reporting of about 12,000 or whatever the number is, that's just from the NGO Bureau, those that are only registered permanent, multiple ways of registrations, as well as their own accountabilities. So maybe as we go forward, the course that we are doing, we need to be sure that we are not equating just one subsection of it to the other. So in a way, the point here is, which has already been made, I think, variously, is that even whatever is reported is grossly under-calculated.
All right, thank you, Prof. Marty, for this insight. I think our colleagues here will take note of it. But I see Dr. Max Belafonte has joined the webinar. I know you work a lot, Dr. With the Federation of Association for the Promotion of Rights of Persons with Disabilities. So, and you have opportunity to also go through the report, the literature review report for Côte d'Ivoire. So maybe share your reflections based on your experience with working with people with disabilities, and also, some of the areas that we also need to tighten up regards to these areas as we move on to the qualitative insight of the project. So please open up and share your thoughts on this. If you are speaking, you are muted. I see you are muted. Hello, you are muted, Doctor. I see you are online, but you are muted. I don't know that from the IT side, can we unmute him to speak, or he's supposed to do that himself? Waiting.
He can unmute himself.
So there's also, whilst waiting for that, maybe there's also a question here that says, thinking aloud. So to what extent do interventions align with dignified work perceptions of the youth? Any of our presenters can touch on this question if you want to share some thoughts. So I invite our presenters. Any of us can do that for us whilst we wait for Dr. Lafonde. We have some few minutes to wrap up. Dr. Roslyn, Dr. Professor Sene, maybe you can reflect on that.
Okay, thank you, Chair. Maybe I can respond to that. And I don't think I have an answer, because when you talk about the literature, we were looking at what is there already. that can be found. So when you talk about to what extent do interventions align with Dignified, I think there is a big project that I think all of us, we are really looking forward to see how all these interventions and what are the findings of this, and see whether they aligned with what the youth in Kenya, the theories, the Western theories, or how they perceive their dignity aligned with what the youth in the African context think about these perceptions of dignified work. So I don't have an answer for now, but I hope maybe Dennis, you can tell us from the preliminary findings.
Maybe just to jump in, Chair. I think this is a very complex question, depending on from which angle are you asking from. As Rosalina said, from the literature perspective, because I think we have already identified some gaps in terms of lacking empirical evidence from the ground that engages with the youth themselves. But what we know from other literature around development intervention is that the reason why most of them they fail, it's because they tend to take a top-down approach where they model the programs that they want to implement within communities without necessarily engaging communities. So, from some of the literature that was copying from South Africa, or some of the work that is being done within the space, it is clear, and I think it also came out of the country reviews from other countries, to say some of these organizations that donor funded, they are doing specific work, meaning that the agenda is already predetermined. There is really to no flexibility in terms of the implementation. But then what does that mean when you implement such projects within marginalized communities that have got their own specific needs and aspirations? So there will be always that tension until these organizations, they really go down, consult people, and then they take a grassroots approach to their implementation. And then we will begin to see some alignment along those lines. Thank you.
All right, thank you. Maybe we will now invite, I don't know if Dr. Belafonte can hear us now. If you can, we have some few minutes to close so that you can share your thoughts. If you can hear us, please unmute and then speak. All right. I don't think I'm not sure. Maybe he's struggling with the connection, but I see him online here. I don't know if there are more questions. If there are no questions, I will invite Prof. Moyo to close us as we come to the end of the presentations. Prof, over to you. Prof, if you are speaking, you are muted. Maybe I'll ask, I don't know if Prof. Marty, if you can close us so that you can hear us, if you can close us. I see Prof. Moyo is not speaking.
Thank you, Dr. I don't know whether Prof. Moyo can hear us, but just in case you can't, let me take this opportunity to thank the three presenters, but also the respondents that offered their reflections, which I think positions were very rich, informative, but also will help us make sense of the core questions that this particular project is trying to grapple with. And I think importantly, they help us to signpost the issues that have been we continue to pursue in the empirical part of the study, which we've just completed the quantitative elements, and we're now embarking on, or maybe some countries have already done that, I'm not sure, on the qualitative elements of this. In a way, I would echo what the presenters, but also the respondents have said in terms of helping us with understanding the dignity. I like interconnectedness that the Ubuntu does bring into this, exactly what the value that it brings into helping us understand that we are not creating jobs for the sake of jobs. What is the quality of these particular jobs? How do they help us build our own communities, but also recognizing the agency of young people in our communities as an integral part of the design, but also not just as consumers or partakers of whatever is being given to them. In a way, these conversations continue. If I'm not mistaken, is this the last of the presentations on the literature reviews?
There's one last to go.
Yeah, one more. Okay. But they continue, and part of that particular continuity is even up once you're done with the literature review, we would love to see the audience come back again to hear about what the empirical parts are giving us, because then we start having conversations that confront, as we were told earlier, the elephant in the room, which is the issues that are at play. I know most neoliberalists will argue that non-profits are a good thing, and they're coming to fill a gap left behind by the other sectors. Feminists have told us that that's the responsibilization of the primary agency, that is about structures that are supposed to be responsible for this. The state, for that matter. We all pay taxes in one form or another. We may also be very harsh on non-profits in the way we critique them, but then they are embedded in global economic power structures that are not necessarily very easy to disentangle themselves from. But I think a fundamental question, especially from an African agency perspective, is should our institutions, if we claim they are ours, continue being heavily dependent on these external power structures? Or do we need to start thinking of other ways of ensuring that we resource these institutions so that they can be able to speak to and address African issues, in this case, Africa's youth unemployment, and probably more developmental issues more broadly in a far more better manner. I think the experiences of the US aid withdrawal in the last year and the various responses from both internally but also other external actors speaks volumes to this. This morning I woke up to reading some papers from Kenya, and I saw that a prominent Pan-African was turned away and deported to South Africa. I think last week it was, about 5 days ago. And you're left wondering, no, it was Monday, you're left wondering, what are we getting ourselves to? And I know this happens because East Africa has become an enclave of where leaders are protecting each other at the expense of citizens. It has happened in Uganda, it has happened in Tanzania. Now Kenya is following suit, deporting or detaining people for apparently no reason. Non-profits will continue to play that huge role, not just offering direct jobs, but the advocacy around this, and therefore the project is extremely important in that regard. And for our students who are part of the audience, I hope that you can be able to get glimpses that are extremely important for the type of work that you're also pursuing your own research. That does inform the various elements that I believe are of importance to your work. Once again, I want to thank each and every one of you for your presence today and for the good work that has been done for these particular reports, and more importantly, for gracing us with your presence. I know you left very important things to be with us. And then finally to the research team, especially led by Dr. Osei and his colleagues, Dr. Oma, Dr. Chipeta. Thank you for leading this particular process. And we look forward to hearing more and more from you and our associates that are leading these jobs at country level. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Prof, for listening us. The next webinar will be March 18th, so we're sending the invitation around. So we're hoping that you join us again. So thank you so much for joining
Maybe
us.
one last thing, which I forgot. I think we should also bear in mind that this project is whether it's groundbreaking or it's conformist. It's also funded by a donor. This is the Mastercard Foundation, and I think we wouldn't be here without their support. It would be missing an important opportunity to also thank them. The views and whatever is being expressed has nothing to do with Mastercard. It's what the literature is telling us, as you said a little earlier. But other than that, thank you again to each and every one of you.
All right, thank you, Prof. Like I said, the reports are online. Please visit our website, and then you will have more to read on that website. The link is already in the chat. So thank you so much once again for joining us, and see you in the next webinar. All right, bye-bye.